Hey, this is Richard, or Brick, the Fat Man Hilliard, and this is your place at the table. A hot topic, or somewhat hot topic, I guess mild topic, depends on who you ask, recently was the concept of social interaction per a lot of game systems, and should there be a set of established rules to help you conduct what's basically considered social combat. So I like the idea, and I've said that in a previous video in the video response channel. Hey, I got somebody join me. Thank you for joining me. You're likely to log off because it's going to be a long ramble. But mostly I want to talk about the system I use for my would-be game called Stellar Frontiers, i.e. working title, i.e. may never see the light of day because I signed a crappy contract. Anyway, one of the considerations I had to think about was, how does social standing fit in this particular concept? You know, when we talk about, there guys, nice guy, running the red light. Anyway, when we talk about social status, you can look around the world in both the past and the current timeline and see things that will apply to this category, such as the class system that's common in many countries, including the United States. We pretend like we are a classless society, but that's always been a load of bunk, and it still is. Because you have the poor, the middle class, and the rich, right? The 1% club, which is, irony of ironies, my go-to term for those uber wealthy types in my game system. We call them platinums, or the 1%ers, because that's they've got so much loot, so much wealth that it just, the average individual can never, ever, in several generations and lifetimes of generations, compete in their category of wealth. But that is not the only status for social interaction or social standing in the game as in games as we know it. And in my game, looking at the economic status, so whether you call it class or caste or economic situation or 100 other pithy names that I'm sure much more articulated individuals with deeper verbiage, vocabularies than I can come up with on the fly without having to do a bunch of Googling and hunting through a dictionary and sounding like I just hunted through a dictionary by way of Google. So, to look at that perspective, I quantified what the low, the medium, the middle class, the upper middle class, the lower 1%, the upper 1%, and then the extremely uber wealthy types that really don't fit in the 1%. They would be the 1% of the 1% club, or 1% of a 1% of a 1%, right? We have a few of those types, but you usually got to go to places like Saudi Arabia to find that kind of wealth. And in my game system, that would be the uber nobility. And in reality, even for them, wealth is finite, because while they may have extreme amounts of income coming in, they have extreme amount of expenditures because they're ruling and creating a kingdom. They're constantly, or should be constantly, building and improving and expanding, and that's what wealth is for. It's a tool, but it's a powerful tool. So I created this thing called the standard of living, SOL. Yeah, the standard of living. So the average Joe Q public, the untrained laborers of the world, are going to be in the poor to middle class. So they're going to be in the bottom two social SOLs, two bottom social levels of, So these individuals don't have a lot of clout amongst anybody in their higher categories, in the higher standards of living practice. And it's as the realities of the way the world works. There's modifiers, of course. But before I get to that, I want to continue a little bit about standards of living. So with standard of living, and thank you for briefly joining me and then logging out. Like I said, this is going to be about a 40-minute ramble because I got about a 40-minute drive if everything goes right. The standard of living for these individuals are actually not filthy poor, because we're talking an advanced society, advanced civilization, etc., a la Star Trek and Star Wars. So you know, even the poorest folks, unless they're on the most remote planets and the most remote settlements on a given planet, usually have access to reasonable food supplies and medical care, basic subsistence level stuff and above. So they have a few comforts. But we're talking, let's say $20,000, $25,000 American yearly. You know, you can barely eke by, and if you have a couple people in your household, each making about the same, then you can live somewhat comfortably because you're in the next medium class standard of living, because you're sharing the load. And that's part of the modifiers that comes later. The higher the level you go, the more wealth you have, but the more responsibilities that you have as well. The more perks that come with your standard of living, but that's because you're shelling out that money for those extra perks. You know, it's nothing, there's no free lunch anyway. And so if I look at fantasy role-playing games, a la Dungeons and Dragons, AD&D, and the 400 different possible clones out there of it, the idea back in the day when we used to keep track, we were resource managers, and I like that term, that we keep track of our coins and our expenditures, making sure we've got enough arrows and replace lost weaponry and pay for our meat and our chicken off the bone and stacking that stuff up on a regular basis. Now, as time goes on, we tend to dismiss a lot of that. We ignore it. At some later versions, there's been concepts, and this comes up in other game systems. Shadowrun has a variant of this, is where you have basically, once again, a standard of living. So you're going to outlay X amount of credits or X amount of gold or silver or X amount of dollars per month to keep you supplied with the basics, to take care of the basics. So at this point, it's a lot easier to keep track of your bottom line, keep track of your incidentals, and resource management becomes simplified. So all I got to do is make sure I make enough loot or get enough of an income to pay my standard of living that I've grown accustomed to. And you can modify that for any game system. So wealthy adventurers who have been very successful could be expected to live much better than the level ones who are just starting out. So have access to finer inns and restaurants, and having access to finer clothing and better victuals and libations would be expected. So in my system, we talk about all that being standard of living. Now, when you hit the platinum level, this is often in the lower end of the platinum level. Your NPC, your ministers for your house in the game, for example, traditionally are in the upper class, the high standard of living to platinum level, and then a diamond level, imperial level, so forth. The reason for that behind it is because they need to maintain a certain status of appearance. They need to be dressed properly. They need to have a small entourage, even if it's just a couple of assistants and a chauffeur. They need to have possibly a private vehicle, perhaps a luxury vehicle of some sort, because they're going to go out and they're going to interact and acts of diplomacy and negotiation for your house lord. They're going to act in the place of your house lord and allow your character, if you will. These are what would be considered characters for my game, and the player maintains basically a number of different characters that fit certain roles. And so the standard of living for these individuals is important. And as it goes up, so does their, like I said, their perks. So a higher level platinum is going to not only have a private assistant and a number of flunkies, maybe a Boy Friday or a personal valet, butler, chauffeur / bodyguard, perhaps the chauffeur and bodyguard, and maybe even a squad of security or additional security where we have a platoon worth of securities. That way we have security 24/7. You always have a squad, i.e. five well-armed individuals within a whistling distance to keep your minister protected or your house lord protected. Now, there's reasons for that standard of living, because obviously if I'm going to interact, if I'm going to conduct a diplomacy or a negotiation with somebody of a lower standard of living, then I'm going to have advantages over my foe in this aspect. So if a medium class flunky or a medium class citizen comes to talk to the minister has a very large advantage over this slower social standing individual, and it shows in the modifiers. I think at medium class we have a negative, in my game it's a negative 10%. At the poorest class it's like negative 50%, and at high class you've got 0 modifier. The first level of the platinum status, you have a plus 10, and then it goes plus 20, so on and so forth. The negatives are much higher than the positives, so the higher you go up, it's not necessarily going to be a huge leap upward in percentage points. And I use a D100 system, so you can simplify that by just dropping a 0 and calling it a D10 system or a D20, however you want to look at it. So in this case, the minister is going to have a big advantage over the middle class taxi driver who's going to try to negotiate with him for, I don't know, maybe a tip, maybe more money, maybe for a position, maybe just that he wants to gripe and he'd like to get an audience with the House Lord, which is likely not to happen, but the modifiers are there. So this means that while the lower social standing individual has a very slim chance of actually succeeding in a negotiation or a diplomacy, it's not unheard of. It is that small percentage chance. There's always there's never a negative 0. So you never have a negative 150 against you. You hit a bottom of 10%. So in the game, you've always got at least a 10% chance of being heard. Whether or not you get to achieve what you want, that's another animal, because there's a set of mechanics that deal with this sort of stuff. So we come to the modifiers for my standard of living, and this applies in so what would we consider social combat? What we're talking about is social situations where we're trying to get something through diplomacy or through negotiation, through barter. In some cases, these same rules apply to interrogation. It's just the roles are the percentages are kind of flipped on their head. You want to be more stubborn when it comes to and get your opponent get less from you during an interrogation than the other way around. But the same set of rules work for all these categories. Now, in that mindset, I looked at things like, okay, we've got our status of living, and this covers a lot of stuff. So I don't have to nitpick over too many details. But we always want modifiers. This is a game type system that most of us are familiar with, where you get pluses and you get negatives for this or that. So I looked at things like, okay, a tire. Are you purchasing stuff off the rack, or are you getting things from a tailor, i.e. custom made? Are they made out of mundane, regular, easily obtainable materials such as cloth? Silk in the future would not be all that rare. because they can easily cultivate the silkworms and so on and so forth, or even synthetic versions thereof, which is another thing. Are you using legitimate material or synthetic material? Because the synthetic material is considered a bit less appealing than the actual stuff. And while the contours, if you will, of the wealthy types may or may not know, I don't know what that was, may or may not know if you're wearing a synthetic jacket or not. There are some that would notice this. And there's big ways around that, of course, is by who made it. So if you bought something that came all the way from Earth, even a mundane, mass-produced jacket, because it has a tag from Earth, is going to be much, much more valuable as an item and have a higher modifier for making an impression in a social situation than something that's been made in a factory planet within your neighboring region of space. What offsets that in your region of space is having natural tailors, seamstresses, clothiers, people who hand make items out of exotic materials, custom made for the individual. So, as an example, my friend Shannon's game world, or his house Hatheon, and it's populated by aviaries, which are human avian hybrids. And the first highbrow tailor to set up a shop on his world was a fellow by the name of Mas Lagasse. So, ever since then, the House Lord has been patronizing Mas Lagasse and for his custom-made attire, and bringing him exotic materials or obtaining exotic materials to enhance the wardrobe that he wears, making him look even more impressive. And because the House Lord patronizes this individual, suddenly that individual, Mas Lagasse, becomes very, very sought after from among his peers, the Lord's peers. So all of his platinums are going to rush out to Mas Lagasse and commission him to create wardrobes for them. And this, of course, enhances Mas Lagasse's standing, which makes him a much more socially blah, blah, blah. So this pays off. So if we not only have exotic clothing, but we have exotic clothing made by, somebody very, very prestigious, we've just added a modifier to our social standing when it comes to interactions, or at least negotiations and diplomacy, social situations. So in that same venue, because part of the game's concept is exploring your worlds and just finding discoveries of exotic and rare things and finding ways to exploit them and make money off of them and to find uses for them, you have a number of things like perfumes. You can find exotic animals and plants that have a byproduct that's very appealing. Whether it's the fibers or it's their appearance or some sort of dye that can be made from them, or the exotic smell, taste, what have you. So you put in the effort to manufacture these things and turn these things into exotic materials, then you take them to your Mas Lagasse and have him custom make you a suit out of it. And next thing you know, all your peers, or all your would-be peers, are all rushing out to do the same thing. So we gain status. So we gain additional modifiers. So we can have an exotic wardrobe. We can have a Terran-based wardrobe, and have a +3 modifier, or plus, in this case, it'd be a plus, it'd be +3. Because these things are minute, not as opposed to the larger categories. So if you had a platinum status and you had a +20 to your social interaction with anybody, and you are wearing a Terran-made wardrobe, now you've got a 23. So if it's a Mas Lagasse's in House Hatheon, the locals will see in their own minds will have a +5 as opposed to +3. Now this this same wardrobe may not have the same impact if you visit a rival house or some other place, because they don't carry the social standings. Mas Lagasse, who's that? What is that, some kind of fungus? You're wearing fungus? Oh my God! That could be a faux pas and gain you a negative, right? So we look at these different things, perfumes and so on and so forth. Now we get into some really exotic stuff. We have some slight modifiers for influencing other people. So if I wear a certain cologne that is known to be attractive, makes you more attractive to another person. It doesn't matter what the sex is in this case. It just makes you more. You feel like this person. There's something about this individual. I don't know. She stands out among the crowd. Well, it ain't because she's wearing Mas Lagasse. It's what is it? Something about her hair, or something she's wearing. But the point being is that there's additional ways to influence social interaction. So your social combat can see a slew of weapons, i.e. weapons, items, clothing, jewelry, scents, unguents, oils, body, what have you. The list is just, endless for creativity side of things. So then I looked at, okay, what other things could I come up with that would enhance somebody's social standing? Their standard of living has been established. Their what they do with their standing of living, are they keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak? Are they utilizing exotic materials and custom-made wardrobes, so on and so forth? The next one is your entourage. Yeah, you have a lot of status, and you see this in modern media or pulp culture today in some aspects. When you see certain people in the media, in the Sun magazines or the social whatever paparazzi video or shows and things like this. Well, this individual showed up at such and such, which is a highbrow restaurant or a highbrow, a very popular night spot, which segue a minute back to the items, a wardrobe imported from Earth with some name nobody knows about, but it's still from Earth because it's got the label that says so. But you might be, your characters might be going to the right places. You're being seen socially in the right crowd. So this also gains you a slight modifier by saying, I will impress the person I want to negotiate with by inviting them to have dinner at the 10,000 mile whatever, or the golden egg, which is another house pantheon place that sits up on top of a very high peak and is considered posh by most standards. So it's expensive to eat there, and it's hard to get a table. And so if you have enough social standing and to have a permanent reservation, that's going to be quite impressive to people, especially people who are aware of this sort of thing. And obviously you're not going to use that clout against a low-level negotiation. So if your minister's negotiating with that taxi cab driver, he's not likely to take the taxi cab driver to the golden egg, because you're not going to want to waste all that extra potential, because it's overkill. It actually is not going to overly affect the outcome of the negotiation, because when somebody with that high of a social status is negotiating with somebody with almost no social status or none, pretty much everything that the high-level yakety-wak wants goes their way, and because the other guy just can't unless he gets that one dumb luck roll, he might succeed at negotiation. We're going to get to that here a little bit too. So we got our locations, now our entourage. So it's not enough to just say I have a bodyguard / chauffeur. My chauffeur is driving a hover limo that's manufactured by blah, And the level itself is worth a lot of money because we use rare woods and exotic metals and crystals, and et cetera, in the construction of it. Or we've imported it from someplace that's very prestigious, so it adds value. It's like our Cadillacs and our Volvos and our freaking Rolls Royces. You know, look at a Volvo's an impressive piece of technology, and Mercedes is far more. And then Rolls Royce is a Rolls Royce, and a Lamborghini, come on, right? The only reason you buy a Lamborghini is because you're trying to impress everybody. You know, they're really wealthy people buy them as an investment. They don't buy them as a status symbol, because they can buy so many of them that it kind of cheapens the status symbol. Why waste your money on Lamborghini when I could have a 10 cabin yacht that costs me $20-30 million a year just to keep it operating? I may never even set foot on the darn thing, but by gosh, I'm going to have one because my so-and-so neighbor's got 2 of them. So here we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. So there's value in that aspect too. So when we look at it, so our entourage is going to include this, that, and the other thing, maybe some exotic races or some very posh-looking individuals. In some cases, it's not uncommon for a higher-level muckety-muck to include lower-level muckety-mucks relatives in their entourage. So, if you happen to be the Duke of a fantasy realm and you're trying to interact at the court and you're having social combat, it is quite impressive if you happen to have 2 or 3 people that are working for you that are from one of the other important houses or one of the other important nobles' families. So there was a reason why young girls and young boys were often fostered off into other houses as well as sent to court, because it gave them opportunity, socially speaking, to interact with not only their peers but higher level peers, to become ingratiated with them. So maybe that upper level duke's son is going to take the baron's younger son as his squire, for example, or the high lady is going to utilize a couple of the young ladies from a neighboring king or dukedom or earldom or whatever that they're on good terms with, because it is socially a good idea. It's going to impress the other people that don't have these people working for them. It's also going to further ingrain their two noble houses together, as an example. So in my game system, having exotics and having very capable of individuals also means having technical specialists that specialize in a lot of different things. So, it might be impressive to have a platoon worth of security, but it would be a whole lot more impressive if you have a squad of special forces security, ex-SEALs or ex-Royal Guardsmen who, are now employed by you to keep you safe. And in addition to having a larger security detail, but you have a prestigious element to it and a very much more capable option available to you for defending it. And in some cases, you may utilize these assets for other purposes, which can be used in many different layers of the onion when it comes to moving around in the social circles. A lot of times in social circles, it's not how big your sword is, it's how much dirt you have on your opponent. What do you know or what do they think you know, and what do you know? And more importantly, how much of your secrets do they know? And how much of that are you sure they know? Because there is some very, very, very complicated, very subtle ways of having this social combat scenario. So when I look back at interacting with making negotiations and diplomacies and so on and so forth, having all the bling, having the right wardrobes, having the right status, having the right flunkies hanging around, all this adds up. unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a lot of the times the people that you're negotiating with or acting in diplomacy with are on equal or close to equal standing as yourself. So a lot of this excess stuff may be canceled out by the excess stuff of your opponent, which brings you on a much more level playing field. But it can make up for when you're dealing with a higher level buckety-buck or a lower level buckety-buck, depending on how you look at it. And certain things apply in certain situations, and having the depth knowledge of being able to apply them in the right way to get the right kind of bonuses makes a difference. Now, one thing I ran into was, when I dealt with this, I didn't want this extended social situation to just get out of hand. I didn't want this negotiation to take place and have to take 2 days to do. It's bad enough if you guys sit at a table and roll a bunch of dice and interact for an hour and a half to achieve a goal. Sometimes it works out that way and you don't have a choice, but ideally you want to simplify things a little bit whenever you can. So we looked at how these things progress. So it's like a salvo or a gambit. I'm going to open with this, and I'm going to try to impress you with it. And either I'm just going to impress you subtly by what you see, smell, and hear, and then I'll try to overtly flash, to impress you by surprising you with something very special or unique, or, I've hired a special band for the party, or I have invited these media stars, and they've shown up. And so I've got an extra one up on you because you didn't get that at the last time you threw a party or a negotiation. Or like I said, I'm going to negotiate with you. So, I brought you this exotic, rare blue eel caviar from the world, the land beneath two moons. So it's rare and expensive and hard to get, and I'm gifting it to you. And that gift is going to give me a temporary modifier, a one-shot modifier that once it's used is gone. And if I get a favorable reaction, then I get modifiers for those favorable reactions. If positive modifiers. If I get a negative reaction, I get a negative modifier. And these things begin to stack. So there's two sets of modifiers, ones that stack and ones that are one-offs. So you're going to use these things. Your wardrobe is a one-off. I'm wearing this wardrobe, so I get a +5 in my opening gambit. And then after that, your opponent is no longer concerned about or impressed by what you wear. So you're going to proceed to the next thing. Oh, I didn't know that you have I have a blunt heart diamond that flashes with every beat of my heart, so you can see if I'm getting irate or excited or whatever. And it's worth $20 million or 20 credits, depending on depending on what game system you're in. All right, and 20,000 gold pieces. Your opponent is temporarily impressed. You get a +20 modifier because they're so bloody expensive and so rare on that negotiation. At some point, though, your weapons, as you will, become used up. So you don't get to keep using them over and over again. At that point, your negotiation starts to dwindle. You're either going to get a success and your opponent agrees to what you want, and maybe agrees depending on the level of your success. Now, that's how my system is set up. So the higher your success, the more likely more that your opponent's willing to do. So if you're negotiating in my game system, if you're Minister of Intelligence or Minister of Commerce is negotiating with a representative of a major corporation, a major guild as they're called, and you're trying to get them to build a number of factories on a couple plants, and you're successful in your negotiation they agree to it, and you're so successful, they're so impressed that they're willing to do that and say one more thing. So at this point, we have a second set of modifiers that come into play, so you can add and ask for, if you're going to build this, why not build that? Or how about opening corporate headquarters on our capital, which will gain our planet some extra revenue and population growth and blah, blah, blah. And if you're high enough in your percentages, that platinum agrees readily to this. The opposite is the same. You can get a low ball and discover that platinum's not overly impressed by your general offer and wants to know, what more can you do for us, or more importantly, what more can you do for me, depending on your culture. So having that ready, handy bribe is also one of those one-off weapons that you can throw out there at the right time. So if I gift you with an expensive wardrobe from Los Legacy, and it's worth a plus 15 on this next negotiation because I've been holding it in reserve, or I just out and out gift you $15 million because what's $15 million amongst billionaires except a nice little extra chunk of spending change, but it still gets you that plus 15 modifier, so you can make that attempt to still get what you're trying to get for, or to make one more shot. But eventually your negatives add up to the point where there's no longer any possibilities of a constructive discourse. Your negotiation, for all intents and purposes, has ended. So we look at this stuff for a minute, and I go, okay, I get it that most social interaction ideally is role played out. ROL. We're going to role play at the table. We're going to show ourselves up as these roles. But in some aspects, and I felt this myself back in the day, that you don't have a lot of common ground to start from. The whole idea, and there's a lot of people that hate the extra rules. There's just too many rules. It's just rules heavy, yada, yada, yada. Well, my friends, honestly, be truthful to yourself. These games that have light rules, the only reason they can have light rules is because the heavy rule games have dominated for decades. Most people who are players and any significant experience are experienced with those types of games. So they don't need to have, the next game generation comes out, doesn't need to cover a bunch of that stuff, because in the back of your mind, the back of your co-players' minds, we all understand the concept behind, what's the nuances for climbing a tree versus climbing a side of an ice-covered cliff, right? We may not need to have them written down in the book for us, because we no longer need that. And it makes it convenient for the game because we can ice things up, so to speak. We can slide along faster because we don't have to worry about it, or we choose not to worry about it, right? So this perspective goes along that line. And having those mechanics, having those rules available for those of us who are not adept at that banter at the table as much as we'd like to be. What if we have a set of, that set of extra rolls that we can make? So even if we're stumbling and bumbling and fumbling ourselves at the table, we can be successful on the table with our dice, right? And like I said before in a previous video, my belief is, a lot of people don't like this stuff. They don't like the extra rules. Yop. Okay, and you're all welcome to that. And I will never say you shouldn't be able to play that way. But I think you should equally be willing to allow the others who would like that their time at the table, so to speak, their day at the table. Meanwhile, we can look at the idea that if we take this in the opposite direction, like I said, most of us have played at tables where we've gotten into combat that took frickin' hours. 2 hours to settle one scenario that should have taken, in actual game terms, lasted 3 minutes, because it took so long to maneuver and to check the rules and to banter, which is what a lot of us come to the table for. I grant you that. I will grant you that, and I'm not trying to take away from that. That is, honest to gosh, I'm not trying to take that away. What I'm saying, though, is that we oversimplify a lot of other things in the game to speed stuff up, but we never oversimplify combat like we do, everything is now. And I had a little bit of a discussion with my game group, a one-sided one anyway, more or less, earlier about the idea of old OSR systems. There was a time, if anybody has played the old Rollmaster game system, you'll know combat is swift and brutal. the hit location charts and the damage charts are purposely designed to inflict damage at a prodigious rate. The idea that you've got a tank, nobody ever, the idea of a tank didn't exist 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Oh, we had the concept of an armored knight, but the actual terminology as we see a tank today, this brute force, immovable thing that's a bunker up against the heaviest foes while the rest of the team rallies behind it. Well, isn't that great? Things with 100 hit points and enough can deal 70 hit points of damage on a blow, or can do multiple attacks. I mean, there's a couple of combinations of feats and certain levels of feats that you can basically get into a buzzsaw mode where you just keep trucking. You got an army of orcs ahead of you and you just keep trucking. That guy just killed 30 orcs because he went from hit to hit to hit to hit to hit to hit, because that's how it all stacked up. Isn't that grand and great fun? You bet. You betcha. That's why it came out. That's why those combinations appeared. But that's because at some point we became enamored in these extensive simulation combats on the table, where back in the earlier days, combat was a little more efficient. The system was keeping it simple. The KISS system, right? So we got away from the KISS system, got into a very complicated system, and then people started going, oh, there's a skunk somewhere. Everybody wants to dial back from that, and we want to simplify things now. We want to get into the more KISS system. That's why we talk about rules light so much. We want to get away from having 50 damn dice rolls at a sitting. And and I can relate to that. I'm just as into that category as most people are these days. I like to have the mechanics, though. I like to know I have a place to reference things from. I have a starting place to begin stuff. So having a set of mechanics for social interaction, whether you want to call it social combat or not, so be it. It's still social interaction, and it should be treated in that kind of venue. There should be a bit more to it than a single dice. You're lucky. It's a luck roll. I mean, let's be honest about that for a minute. Our systems have turned basically social. If you're going to charm somebody or seduce somebody or to win somebody over to your side of things, you got one shot, more or less one shot at success, and that's that. So it's a one shot and oversimplified. And could be more or less, are you lucky? Are you feeling lucky, Fred? Are you feeling lucky? The king's lucky. The king's got big brass balls, and he's going to throw them at you like freaking 100 deep percentage dice that are all crystal and shiny. And you've got one measly little D20 with a couple pluses there to toss to give that chance to win him over to your side of the thing. One shot. Is that really how it's supposed to work? I'm just asking. Is that ever how it works? Do we not fudge that at the table? If we manage to get some social interaction going by role play, as in ROLE versus ROLL, do we not fudge this? Will we not give that second MacGuffin roll? You got lucky and you didn't quite get it, but try again. We might call it something else, and we might be, no, hear me out, King. Just a minute, King. What about this? How if we try it this way? And he tosses his dice again at the table. So, isn't that kind of what we do? But we're dealing this with actual physical combat. Oh, no. You fumbled. You take your lumps, and you recover, and you attack again. And you keep attacking until you've defeated your opponent. Your opponent concedes, your opponent's dead or runs away. There's social versions of that. Absolutely social versions of that. And I truly would like to see a bit more detailed sets of mechanics for that sort of thing. Whether or not that most of your games are going to come up with this stuff, probably not. It's hard to get them to move, but I could see supplements I could see a supplement for Dungeons and Dragons for this kind of stuff. Matter of fact, I got a book that helps you understand things like running a kingdom or running a church or running, a big organization. So somebody at some point was kind of thinking a little bit along these lines. We need a little bit more information because, how does a royal court work? How does the high muckety mucks of a religion at their grand temple work, etc., etc.? Like I said too to my players earlier, I says, hey, have you ever noticed that certain feats and certain magic-like abilities seem to lend themselves to social interaction? It's like at some point they thought they were going to do something with this stuff, and then they just kind of stalled out. Well, let's just we'll give a little extra oomph and edge here, because there's so many feats that never get used. It's like magic. There's so many magics that rarely get used because, except for that one rare occasion where somebody goes and an epiphany occurs and says, oh, let's use this, or can we benefit from that? It's not used. And it's like I've said in the past when it comes to magic, you are in a urban environment or a social environment. Certain kinds of magics are much more, the subtle magics, the magics for clairvoyance and for far seeing and eavesdropping and whispering and creating creating suggestions and things like this have much more power, are much more potent if you're using them in that social combat role, that social combat situation, than if you're using them for whatever you use them for, if you ever use them for. Well, here we are at the place I'm doing. I come every month. It is a grocery store. Got a huge chain of these things in Iowa and a few of the surrounding states. Got a nice little interceptor over here to the left that they added when they built this little gas station. So there you have it. A little bit of my ramble, a lot of my blather, some ideas for what I use for my game system for negotiating social situations, which negotiations, diplomacy, interrogations, a lot of these things all fit into that category. So, till next time, keep an eye on the